I'm going to. And we are finally back for another Leadership and Legal Live session. My name's Steve Lois, and my co-host
James Reed. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. We were off a month ago when we had this thing planned due to a death I had in the family, but we are back to tackle something that is pretty important that everybody's having a conversation with. And we put this out there as a teaser, all about the big quit. That's what we're going to have this dialogue about today. So we are live on Zoom, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. So if you're on one of those mediums, to make it easier for James and I, we're going to put out our cell number. If you have a contact, or if you have a comment or a question, text it to one of us. Mine is 734-837-8500. James, 734-649-1313.
Exactly.
So
Lucky 1313.
Yeah, we've got our cell phones here. It's just easier than tracking all of the different media that's out there. If you want to make a comment, please send that to us. So let's kind of roll into this thing, because the big quit, the great resignation, the great shuffle, the great reevaluation, the great, I think is affecting every employer all around right now.
There's no doubt. I'm hearing all the good employees are going to join the great employers, and all the bad employees are going to stay with the bad employers.
So let's talk about that. What's real from your perspective, James? And I'm going to throw in some thoughts and some stats, because I found the stats just incredibly interesting on what some of the things that we're seeing. From the legal perspective and from all the employers that you work with, what the hell's really going on?
I think everybody is evaluating if the grass is really greener on the other side. And even those loyal rockstar employees are almost feeling like they'll miss out if they don't at least understand what their worth is to another employer.
So is that the driver? And then how does that align with what we were just talking about? Because now there's this great regret thing happening. And this morning I looked at two stats because I wanted to get them accurate. One said 70% of those people that have changed jobs in the last 12 months regret the change. Doesn't mean they're going to go back. And then the other one said 20% regret the change. I mean, how do you align those things to what you're just talking about?
I think the value of loyalty is not being appreciated or factored in enough.
Yeah.
And if you go somewhere else, you have to build all those relationships and that trust all over again. And if you already had trust and you leave without communicating through any issues, you just lost that trust.
So do you? Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Do you think it's about the money? Do you think it's about the trust? Do you think it's a combination of those two? What's really causing it? And then the third question, I'm going to weigh in on this one because I'm pretty passionate about the third one, is did COVID cause it?
I think the answer to all the questions, is also when you fire someone or hire someone in employment, it depends, and there's a factor thing. There's never only one factor, right? So did COVID cause it? I think COVID allowed people to reflect.
Yeah.
And I think when you're reflecting and you're thinking about what's important to you, that sometimes your values change, or maybe you had a taste of remote work, or a taste of a 4-day work weekend, and a taste of higher pay. All of these different variations make you wonder if you could have that permanently for your entire life. And I think companies that are offering that temporarily, some employees are drinking the Kool-Aid and think that's going to be a permanent arrangement.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I keep telling all of our clients this, and those that I'm talking with, is if you had problems before COVID just they exaggerated the problems. I think a lot of this work-life balance stuff, as everybody's calling it, was already a problem.
It was.
And COVID just said, oh, there is another option, potentially working from home and everything else. but I don't think it caused the problem. I think it exacerbated the problem because, to your point, people started to see the other things that are out there.
The problem was always there, no
Yeah.
doubt, but I think the solution wasn't as easy to find as it is now.
Well, because I think people are still trying to figure out, are they addressing the problem or the symptoms? Because this whole work from home thing, I think it's important, and I think people realize that work could be done from anywhere, but is that a symptom, or is that the root cause of what was going on? Was there already a disconnect between the employee and the employer and how they viewed work life and all this stuff? I believe there was in most cases.
There definitely was a disconnect in most cases, and I think most employers don't actually take the time to understand how they can help the employees accomplish their goals. They more train the employees how to accomplish their agenda.
That's a key piece. I mean, if you're an HR person or if you're a leader actually watching this, I mean, think about this. We go to our team members and we say, here's some development, and it's for what you can do better for me.
That's right.
I mean, we need to do that to a certain extent, but what about here's some development, and here's what it's going to do for you unselfishly? And I don't think we've got the relationship with most of our team members to actually be able to do that, which perpetuates some of the things that we're seeing in the stats.
There's no doubt. And I think because we don't have that conversation, employees sometimes are misinformed and think they're at a dead-end job, not realizing we're happy to promote you. I didn't know you wanted to go to that next level and take on that responsibility.
But isn't that our job as leaders, is to figure out what's the next step for each person, or is that their responsibility? And is there a legal implication on either side of that?
So one, it should be a leader's job to help, have that vision and navigate an employee's potential growth.
Yeah.
But I've never seen that in a job description. I don't think that they're necessarily getting trained that that's an essential function of their job.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of HR and leaders are put out fires and are really good at solving problems thrown in front of them, but if it's not thrown right in front of them, they're not always giving it the attention it deserves.
And I think that's one of the key issues, is why we're here where we are, is they didn't pay attention pre-COVID. COVID happens. It brings attention to some of the challenges that were already out there. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of HR people and leaders are blaming COVID for the challenges that were already there ahead of time. So the question, part of this question, is what do we do about it, and what are the other things that are going on? You shared some articles with me yesterday that I didn't get it right away until we went back and forth on it. Talk about that impact and how it affects what we're talking about with the big quit.
So there are a lot of employees that are not only analyzing their next career path, they're also becoming more disgruntled towards their employer for not doing all the right things all along. And I'm seeing an all-time increase in employment claims. And employees feeling, I think, the audacity to bring in their personal life into the workforce and their personal beliefs, and sometimes almost bait a company to have claims against them.
Do you have an example?
There's a couple examples.
You don't have to mention the name, but if there's some of what you shared with me.
Sure. So some of the public recent articles are that there are a lot of overlapping protected classes that sometimes are in conflict with each other. So if one employee, all of a sudden demands to be called certain pronouns, and another employee says their religious conviction prohibits them from honoring those pronouns, now you have two different protected classes claiming they're not getting the respect and appropriate treatment in the workplace. And if either one of them are disgruntled, they can bring a lawsuit against their employer. And these lawsuits have drastic social media damages. It's almost political. And these cases are being settled for $500,000 just to avoid going through the court and the social media squeeze.
And then somebody's pissed off because they see that and they say, I can't work for an employer like that, so you got more people leaving.
Exactly. So if you take too bright line of a stance that we only want people like this or only want people like that, you just lost potentially half the workforce.
Well, let's think about Disney. I'm going to bring Disney into this because I think the other thing that's happening here is companies have become very political, one way or the other. I don't care which side of the table or three sides of the table that you're on. It's irrelevant. But is it the role of an employer? I know we're getting a little off subject, but this came up in some comments that I received. What do you do in a situation like Disney that says, this is what we're going to stand for, alienate half of my group? Is that the place for an employer? And is there potential litigation as a result of that?
There's always potential for litigation.
Okay, sorry.
I think if you're a disgruntled employee, we're all part of multiple protected classes, and you can definitely sue. And there's a nuisance value to every claim. And if there's a factual dispute, it's going to cost upwards of $100,000 to make it to the actual trier of fact to see who's right. And most people don't want to spend that $100,000, especially when there's political parties backing certain parties just to try to prove a cause. So I think, yes, I don't think it's for the employer to take a bright line stance on political issues that are not business related.
Agreed, but I see companies more and more do. I mean, let's look at what's going on with Twitter right now. They're saying no to an acquisition by one person or a group of people, one Elon Musk leading that, and you've already got so many people saying, if Elon buys it, I'm going to quit. I mean, that's playing into this, and that's a political thing that's going on right now too. Again, regardless of what side of the coin that you fall on that.
Politics are in the workplace more than ever.
Oh my gosh.
And I think COVID was another trigger to make people more aware of what side of the line people fall on for various reasons.
So, I mean, let's come back to that, because I got some questions that have been texted in, because that's an issue in and of itself in the workplace that I think is perpetuating all this turmoil within the workplace, and people are actually leaving. Since when did we make companies so this is the line that we fall on to alienate half of our teams, right? That's exactly what we're doing across the board. And when did that? I think that started kind of before COVID. I think it was a political thing with our last election, but
it started before COVID, but I think the internet and social media made CEOs and companies realize that your brand on social media, potentially if you don't have a certain mission that you portray, you could lose billions of dollars just from that alone. And the cancel culture is real.
Oh my gosh, is that real? I mean, that's another thing that's happening right now, that we're seeing people that are leaving and saying, because they did or did not do this in social media, even though it may or may not be true, I'm out of here, because they don't support my purpose, vision, cause, and so on. Purpose is important, but I think that's gotten misconstrued as well.
And people are crossing state lines even for those reasons.
For sure. So I got a question. Or comment and a question.
Okay.
All right. Workplace flexibility is nice, I'm sure, working from home, but I've seen a complete disconnect from corporate in certain cases, largely due to the pandemic policy. How do we find a happy compromise, bringing employees and leadership back together? I mean, I think 80-90% of people watching this are probably saying, what the hell do I do? Because I got a bunch of people working from home. You've already mentioned it. Some want to come back, some don't want to come back, some want to be at home forever. What do we do?
So the surveys are a good place to start, even though I agree the stats are confusing. I saw a recent survey that said 85% of executives believe that you need to come into work at least a few days a week, some of the time, where only 15% of the lower level employees felt that way. So for those employees that want to move up the ladder and excel and advance, is that a signal that they should try to come into the workplace more often? And maybe there's a reason. If you're leading a team, it's easier to interact with people in person, and all of the soft skills and small talk of shadowing somebody. How do you mentor somebody and learn all the soft skills if you're not around them for a large portion of the day?
So let's address that, because I think there's, again, two sides to every coin, right? Because I think it's more difficult for sure when you're not with somebody. Look, if you and I only saw each other every once in a while on video, it'd be tough to get to know each other, right? That's why we go celebrate and do whatever we do, right? But I believe it can still be done in the workplace if leaders are intentional about it. And I don't know that leaders prior to COVID and even now understand what that actually means, so it's easier to say they just need to be in the office. Now, it is much easier when you got a whole group of people in the office to connect with everybody, there's no doubt. But I don't know that it's a situation where you can't do it when they're remote.
I believe you can do it. Technology is advanced. There are many ways to do it, but my personal opinion is that whoever I C is the easy button to give work to. I'm not going to think, who should I call that's not here
Good point.
when there's a capable body in front of me? But if everybody was remote, then yes, I would make it work. But if I am spoiled by having some people next to me, they're going to have an advantage, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, I also think there's some that shouldn't be remote, and I don't think it's a positional thing. I mean, look, if you walk into a bank, you need a teller,
Right.
I get sometimes there's electronic tellers. I get that. But I do think some people are actually struggling with working remote, and if you would have known a little more about them, you would have known the struggle. Now, how do you deal with that? From a legal perspective and from a leadership perspective, I have two people in the exact same position. I know one thrives in social interaction. I know one thrives kind of being left alone. Now what do I do?
Great question. So I actually had that issue emailed to me today.
Okay.
So an employee was allowed to work remote. Their performance tanked. So the company said, I need you to come back into the workplace. And then there was a doctor's note saying that they have stress, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And being around other people and the noises, they'd rather be somewhere where they wouldn't have those distractions.
Okay.
So now the employer's saying, James, what do I do? And I haven't shared the advice yet with this client, but my advice is going to be, you never have to eliminate an essential function of the job. And if you expect a certain level of performance and they can't reach that level of performance at home, then you could give them unpaid leave to get help and accommodate them until they're able to do all the essential functions of the job. So it's completely fine to have a performance standard to allow the remote work perk. And if they are not able to achieve that, then you could try to accommodate on site and maybe give them some level of privacy and ability, but you're not going to give them the corner office just because they would rather have more quiet.
So in order to, let's say we went completely remote, right?
Yep.
We didn't care. We got people that come into the office where we are today. We got people that stay remote. It doesn't really matter. But we were smart enough with a good attorney's help to have in our manual that says if you're not producing, then we can call you back in.
Yeah.
And this is a privilege, not necessarily a right.
Yep.
Is that consistent to kind of what you're talking about, to do it that way, but also be clear about here's the performance metrics that you're going to be under?
That is best practices.
Okay.
But even with that smart provision in your handbook and in your agreements, I'm seeing a new culture where now employees that were used to working at home on Fridays, if they want to come back in or the employer wants them, they want premium pay.
For Fridays.
For Fridays or any type of, so now, exactly. So it's no longer holiday premium pay or weekend premium pay. It's if you work a Friday now because we've been used to those longer weekends.
Because I was working maybe 4 10-hour shifts Monday through Thursday. Okay. Now you want me to work Friday, you're going to pay me premium.
Or they've always had a history of Friday can be a remote day. So how dare I have to get dressed and come into the office now?
So what's the legal position of that?
The legal position is from the employer side, you can require them to come back into work as long as there's not a disability that only happens on Fridays that you would have to accommodate. So you definitely can bring them back. The problem is if an employee is disgruntled, they're going to be able to find a basis to bring a claim against you. They might say, well, you called me back. I know a woman you didn't call back on Friday. Do you hate men now? And that's where the claims start to arise.
Got it. Let's go back to the question, though. So how do we, from a leadership perspective, how do we balance these things? I get from a legal perspective, you can create some boundaries and say, if you're not doing it, come back in. But there's also a policy that you can create your own policy. JP Morgan Chase said everybody come back in. Bank of America, I think, has now kind of pushed to everybody coming back in, and others have done that as well. Do you have a thought or a recommendation around the balance as the question came? Because I know there's a ton of people struggling with it, a ton of people. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts, I love how we talked maybe a year ago, how you said reward people on productivity and performance and not years on your resume and your age and
years of experience
things.
Doesn't equal skill.
Doesn't equal skill.
Yeah.
So in the jobs where you can do that, as long as they're paid less for less productivity and paid more for more productivity, I'm fine as long as the rock stars are not getting undercompensated and burnt out and overworked for being on site, being available and doing it all. So I think that you accommodate it if you can through pay incentives. and you continue to have objective metrics to evaluate performance remote. Some people need to be micromanaged a little bit more.
Yeah.
Some are better not being micromanaged at all and holding themselves accountable. And I think that we need to have our evaluations revamped. I have had employers reach out to me recently saying, how do we revamp our evaluations? Because we're anticipating a downturn in the economy and we want to be able to lay off people without getting sued someday.
We're going to go there in a second, because that's one of the other things that's coming about of this is, comp is one of the biggest things people cite, right?
Yep.
I can go make more money somewhere else, but yet we'll get back into some of those statistics. But I agree with you. I think I don't know that there's one solution that's appropriate for every company. I think you got to really look at it and say, when people went remote, did we lose productivity? And you got to have the data to be able to support that. In our case, and in many other organizations' case, they didn't lose. We actually gained productivity when we went home. Now, we have had a couple of situations where we've had to say, come on back in, and so on. So do you have to bring people back in? I don't, unless it's a role where it's customer facing and the customer's coming into your office, or there's some kind of confidentiality that can't be handled by being remote. I say create the standards and let them do what they want to do, but uphold the standard. So if they're not doing it, get their butts back in, have that conversation so people understand that it's important to be able to do that. That's my personal opinion.
I mostly agree with the personal opinion. I think some of the downsides are, even though productivity might be just as high and maybe are saving some business expenses, there's more to the workplace than just profit and productivity.
Oh, yeah.
And are there any things you're losing by not having, the water cooler talk, the coffee talk, the donuts, the bagels, and interacting with other employees?
That's the intentionality that I was referring to before, because if you just let it go and you don't connect with people and you don't have that time with people, and now you got to do it intentionally because you don't have the water cooler to have it around, the coffee machine to have it around, you're going to, eventually that productivity, I believe, is going to fall off, or productivity could stay up. There's a disconnect, and yet they're still looking for another job because of the disconnect.
I think the loyalty is creating that issue, and now they're taking the other calls from recruiters and looking at other jobs because they don't have that connection. So another survey said 26% of employees have a workplace spouse, and that's what they look forward to make them want to come to work, get excited.
Like my work wife or my work husband.
Yeah, not always romantic and physical.
That's not, I know that. I know what you
But
mean.
even though there is a high percentage of that as well,
Yeah.
I think that without that relationship, it really comes down more likely to money or other small perks at other companies to leave.
I think a lot of times the money is, you're not paying me enough to put up with this crap, so I'm going to go take off.
Yep.
So I agree with that piece of it, and I think leaders. I'm going to put this on leaders, myself included. If we don't take the time to intentionally connect with our people on a regular basis, whether they're remote or in the office, eventually that disconnect happens, and they run anyways. That's one of the things that I think was already happening before COVID. The economy was doing really, really well at the time. We forgot about treating our employees. And I don't mean giving them perks. That's not what I'm talking about. I think there's a place for that. But I mean actually getting to know your people. What's important to James Reed? What's not important to James Reed? How does James Reed define career advancement? Because if you define it and I define it, I guarantee you we'll get two separate definitions.
No doubt. But in reality, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is 80% of our time is spent on the bottom 20%. We're not calling the rock stars that are doing everything, 10 out of 10, saying do this too. You're dealing with people having problems.
And why are we doing that? Because they're having problems.
Because they're having problems.
And I do think there's a challenge with that, and I actually think that's the wrong approach. I think we've got to focus 80% of our time, 70% of our time, whatever it is, with those that are rock stars, because they're the first ones that are going to leave.
Right.
They're the highest performers. We've got to make sure we take them for granted, I believe.
I do too.
And although I think we need to come alongside the low performers to try to make them mid-performers, take the mid-performers, try to make them high performers, if we spend 80% of our time with the low performers, you will continue to lose more of your best performers. I've had that happen in years gone by. So that's a really great point with this whole resignation thing, because you see a lot of top performers leaving right now.
There's no doubt. And a huge issue I'm seeing, I didn't think I was intimidating to talk to, but some staff and associates feel like calling me is like calling the boss and you need to schedule a meeting, so I'm just not going to bother him. I'll instead try to gossip and talk to others, where if we were all on site, casually running into me in the coffee pot, it's easy to have a conversation and ask some things that aren't that important.
Yeah.
So how do you get the staff to actually reach out to you, and it's not just on us to connect with them?
It's been hard,
right?
But it can be done because. So we and I recommend this to every organization. Get rid of annual reviews. We've talked about that in a different one.
Sure.
Because this actually has to do with this great resignation thing. Is connect with your team every single month, scheduled or not. But don't just talk about work stuff. Get a chance to talk about them, what's going on. Keep that connection actually going. If you don't do that on a regular basis, especially your top performers, you're screwed. I don't know how. There's no nicer way to say it. You're screwed.
You're so right. I was actually on a panel recently, and someone was very adamant about the Ford talk, and I was like, Ford? Like, we're in Ford Town, but every conversation, whether it's an employee, a spouse, a friend, is family. Ask about the family. Ask about your occupation goals. Ask about recreation, and ask about dreams.
Okay.
And you have to have that almost on every intimate conversation you have to, I guess, be well-rounded and get to know your employee. And I think that's not done enough. And the main reason is the legal.
You can't talk about the personal stuff. You can't ask too many questions on the personal stuff.
That is the ongoing impression. And what I think we need to do to adapt is ask about the personal stuff. Ask about cancer. Ask about your brother, ask about how you're feeling, ask about all those things. Just don't make Steve Lowitzer or myself the decision maker in any type of good or bad employment decision solely. Let's have now a committee where the committee doesn't know all of those things, and the committee unanimously agrees that the merits of work support up or down. I think we got to change our mindset.
That actually is a key point when I talk about engaging your team members, trying to save them from this, this great resignation, which we all know is happening, is getting to know them at a different level. And I get a lot of pushback from leaders like, I don't want to get too friendly to my team. I may have to fire them someday. Well, if you're already going in with that mentality, you probably don't have a great connection with your team in the first place. But I've kind of always skirted the issue of asking too many personal questions, but I leave it to the individual. Hey, when you think about life in general, because the whole person shows up, the person who fought with their wife or their husband that morning still shows up for work and has some issues, right? Mm-hmm. What are the key areas of life that are most important to you? And if they bring up some of the personal stuff, I got no problem with it, but I'm not going to go prying. I guess is the way that I approach it.
And that is a great point. So speaking of prying or doing too much, there was that other text I sent you about a boss wanted to throw a surprise birthday party for their employee, and that employee had high anxiety and stress and said, I don't want a surprise party, it stresses me out. And the boss did it anyway, and the employee ended up suing and winning for essentially aggravating the post-traumatic stress disorder and depression.
And I think those are the things that scare people away from getting to know somebody a little bit more personally. But I think if you approach it the right way, and it seems, you tell me if there's a legal issue, if I say, hey, give me the six things in your life right now that are most important to you that I can ask you some questions about to help you with. And if 4 of those things happen to be more personal related, but I don't make a decision on those things, but I help them think through those things, am I breaking any laws?
No, you're not. And it's okay to ask protected classes. It's okay to learn these things as long as you're not factoring it into a decision.
Get it. But I think from building that relationship and connecting with somebody, if you know that one of their career advancement to them might mean, I don't want to be president of the company, but I want to do this job really, really well because it leaves me some time to be with Johnny Q on Friday and Susie Q on Friday and so forth. If that's their definition of career advancement, you wouldn't know that unless you asked the question.
You would never know.
And then you take them down a different path, and guess what happens? They get ticked off because they got to work on Friday because you didn't know that was such an important thing, and then they're gone because there's 11.3 million jobs open today.
And I don't think it's going to go down anytime soon.
Well, let's see what happens. I mean, we've got economic conditions that'll actually bounce into this, but I do think, I mean, kind of summarizing this first piece of it is, I think, based on the type of position, we've got to allow some flexibility in it. But I think we really got to look at the people that are in the position, because some just don't operate well, is secluded. In fact, I've seen some people and they're not working here, but they've gotten really dark since they've been secluded working from home, and they feel forced to work from home. I think we got to be careful on that.
That's true.
We've got to understand what makes our teams tick, and we've got to stay intentionally connected. And that's 99% on the leaders. I think leaders have blown it before COVID, have blown it during COVID, and are now blowing it as we kind of come out of COVID. And they're throwing perks and money and everything else, causing part of this problem, instead of actually connecting with the person.
Spot on. I've talked to some people on my team, and they're like, James, the more money is great, but I almost want less pressure to have to, be monitoring my emails at 7 o'clock on a Friday or other things like that.
What was that stat that I saw that I shared with you this morning? It was, so 55% of people said they had a job lined up before they actually quit. But the second piece was 53% of those, 53 of the 55, took a pay cut of $8,000 a year, an average of $8,000 a year. $8,000 a year taking a pay cut. So is it really all about the dollars, or are some of these surveys wrong?
It's not only about the dollars.
I don't think so either. But yet, the Inc. magazine survey, 63% were dissatisfied with pay. Okay, I can be dissatisfied with my pay, you could be dissatisfied with your pay, but it doesn't mean that's the cause that I actually left. It's probably because some jackass pissed me off and a recruiter got me on the right day and I left.
And maybe the expectations are being, I guess, fluffed to these workers, where they think the grass is so much greener on the other side and they deserve more, when maybe it's just a temporary teaser.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So one of the other questions that I got texted just a bit ago, if I'm the employee and my employer says, you got to come back, this is going to be our policy, how do I approach it? What do I do from both a legal perspective if I feel I should be able to stay home? And this is the constant conversation that's going on out there. Is there any recourse? Is there any approach I could take aside from just switching jobs and saying, let's get out of here?
So legally, an employer can require the employee back unless they have a disability or health condition that prohibits them from coming back.
Okay.
If they claim to have such a condition, you're allowed to ask for a doctor's note and explain what that condition is and why you can't come back. And is it temporary? How long is this condition going to last?
Okay.
And then you have to evaluate if there's any essential functions of the job that can't be done remotely, which is now harder to prove in many scenarios.
Especially after you've been doing it remote for the last 24 months, and now to say, well, you can't do it remote. There's some issues there.
There's lots of issues there. That's a good point. We've basically proven to corporate American employees that we can always accommodate a disability with remote work in many scenarios.
Yeah.
So then what we'd likely do is we would then say, okay, fine, you can continue your remote work, but we're going to be monitoring performance a little bit closer. And you can always fire for performance. No disability or health condition ever requires you to ignore performance requirements.
But you got to make sure that you're consistent with the performance requirements. And you got to be clear on what they are.
And that's the problem. If you say, hey, too many HR executives look at this one employee because they're all of a sudden put in front of them and say, I want to fire you, this performance is not the standards I want. What happens is there are other employees that are actually worse performers you didn't know about or that you're not monitoring. And if you say you're fired because you're the worst, and that's a lie, now courts and investigators assume you made up a lie to cover up discrimination, and that's where there's serious liability.
Which that gets out in the press, you're going to lose even more people, and it just perpetuates the whole thing.
Perpetuates itself.
That we're talking about in the first place. That's pretty, all of these are playing into this thing.
And I'm highly concerned about trust. You've been talking a lot about trust recently.
Yeah.
And if you're the executive and you know that 63% potentially of even your team are considering other opportunities, how does that impact your trust in communication with them?
Well, so here's, I'm going to say it from my perspective because I have to deal with this just like any other employer has to deal with it. If somebody really wants to leave the organization, one, I want to know why. And I would hope, and we've seen this play out for the most part, not in all instances, that they're open enough to tell us, here's the things that are concerning, why I want to take a look at other opportunities. If it's the right opportunity for them for the right reason, I wouldn't stop them from going. In fact, I would help them leave the organization, even though it would hurt me. But leaders have to take the time, again, going back to the intentionality. If we don't spend the time to figure out what our team needs and help them achieve that, not just for ourselves, but for them, we're never going to have the level of trust. That's kind of one piece. The other piece is we got to be honest with our team members. Like, honest,
Yep.
whether about the good, about the bad, about the challenges we have, about the future or the lack of the future, about how we're getting ready for the recession that's going to come because interest rates are through the frickin' roof, right? We're seeing all that happen. If we're not having that conversation, they know we're hiding something. And the majority of them are going to leave. And
vice versa, if they aren't communicating that way with you, they're likely hiding something from you.
It is, but I would say this, it's up to, I believe, it's not HR's responsibility and it's not the employee's responsibility to make the first step. Because anybody who's in a leadership role, if you're watching this, if you're in a leadership role, you naturally have the intimidation of being in a leadership role.
That's right.
Whether you're partner James Reed or whether you're CEO Steve Lowe is or anybody else, you've got to you can't wait for them to come to you. That's not leadership in my opinion. You got to go to them, and I think that's one of the key causes that COVID perpetuated, and then we wanted to slap, solutions onto the symptoms and not go back to the root cause of that lack of trust. Does that solve all problems? No. Does it solve most? Yes.
So you raise a great point, but then the question is, how much transparency do you give? Do you believe should they know all of your numbers in your company? What should they know, shouldn't they know?
So the more, I think the more you share and the more you share how they impact it, you should share it, right? So I don't share every single number, but I share about 90%. Right?
Okay.
I share our profit number as a percentage of goal, as opposed to sharing the exact number. We're a privately held company. My executive team knows that bottom line number, but on some of the others they don't. But I think if you don't share as much as you can where they can impact, if you start sharing things that they can't impact, it's like irrelevant information. I don't give a crap. Who cares, right? But if it's, here's how your role impacts this, I think there's a validity to being able to share it with them. I think the more you hold back, the more you run across the potential of pissing them off and showing that you don't trust them.
I love that a lot. Although the challenges are, especially now, I've seen you've hired several people recently, which is great. I doubt every recruit automatically gets paid exactly the same perks and formula as everyone the last 30 years. So how do you deal with new laterals that you have to give certain incentives to and deal with your other rock stars?
Yeah, we have to continually look at that. I mean, we had one of our leaders recently make an offer to somebody who makes more than them. Now, what is that going to cause me to do? Go back and relook at what I'm paying that particular leader. And I think we have to be prepared to be able to do that. Now, I think you also got to make sure you're looking at comp not from just a desperation perspective, where you're just throwing money at the problem, because that's going to bite us in the butt. In a couple of months, as the inflation keeps going up, eventually the job market will slow down. Whether it's this year or next year, I think we're going to see a little bit of a shift in a few months. And then sometime next year, we're not going to have 11.3 million jobs. So what's going to happen? Employers are going to do the exact same they did in 2009. And if you're watching this and you took a job just for the money, pay attention to this. And what are they going to do first when they have to start cutting costs? The people with the exorbitant salaries are the biggest expense. They're going to cut them first. We saw it happen in 2009. That's my opinion.
I think you're spot on, and I think there'll be no loyalty because a lot of these new hires, they're still being evaluated, and they're on the sink or swim track.
But I think, to your point, the honesty is key. I mean, this person who made this offer to this candidate knew he was making an offer to the candidate to make more than them. And I said, we'll take care of it. Let's just get the right candidate without going exorbitant, right? Let's be fair based on some of the economic conditions. But I think we got to be honest with our teams and have that conversation. What's the proposed solution to work on together? That builds more trust than hiding the fact that we're doing that, and then they find out about it, and what happens to the trust with the leader? See ya, I'm out of here. Bye.
But there's also the flip side. You're predicting potentially some type of financial impact sometime potentially this year or next. Employees get scared if you let them know your numbers are going down and you're less profitable. They worry about their security when there could be other employers, saying they're doing fine.
So I think overall there's probably some validity to that, but we didn't experience that, and a lot of companies did not experience that through the COVID drop. Right? If you think about February, March, and April of 2020, when COVID, everybody basically stopped doing any kind of work, I was very clear with our team. Here's what's going on. Here's what's happening. And nobody liked it, but everybody came together and said, here's what we're going to do to help solve the problem. And I think that built more of trust between everybody. Now, can everybody do that? No, I get it. But I think most people, if you treat them like adults, they will react like adults. Could you lose some? Sure. But I think overall, you'll actually retain more and you'll have less of this great quit going on. The more honest and the more open you actually are.
Love it.
All right, question. Depression's a real topic.
Yes.
I know we're changing gears, but it has to do with what's going on. Depression is a real topic, especially on the heels of COVID. I think that was happening before COVID. I think COVID caused even greater, like post-traumatic and so on. It has led to burnout and turnover. I think that was happening before, it just exacerbated it. Have you seen workplace wellness programs that have been implemented that are actually working? Does that help us combat the resignation issues, depression, or both?
So one, the depression is real.
Yeah.
And burnout and brain fogginess are kind of newer protected classes, and even a proven symptom if you ever had COVID that's now being accepted at the EEOC.
Really?
Yes. So there are an expansion of a disability. And then on the second part of the question regarding wellness, I think that more HR professionals are using their own wellness program for the first time.
Yeah.
And I think they're understanding the good, the bad, and the ugly within their own program. And I think that allows them to educate the team firsthand. I used it, and here's what it did for me. So, or they're tweaking their wellness. But Johnny Taylor at National SHRM said most employers' wellness program sucks. It says you get 3 visits and that's it. And how do you solve all problems in 3 visits?
Yeah.
So I think that everybody should take a closer look at their wellness program and see if there's a way to help those employees.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty good point. I do think it's real, and I think too many people are kind of blowing it off as everybody dealt with COVID. Look, it affected COVID. COVID, being at home, being scared about it, whatever your position is on it is irrelevant. The point is it hits certain people really, 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 really hard. And providing some type of support for their mental well-being, I see a lot of companies adding mental wellness now programs where you can talk to somebody more than 3 times if you need to actually do that. And there's been I've seen a kind of a pop-up of companies that provide that service, especially throughout Michigan in particular, but across the country, that's becoming a bigger issue. It was kind of quiet the last couple of years until COVID happened.
I think COVID drastically helped the telemedicine or the telehelp.
Yeah.
So now the laws have even changed to allow people from other states, like physicians, to help cross state lines. And so to the extent you can get your mental health support, virtually, it might be less intimidating to have to go into some clinic somewhere. And I think that is starting to make a positive impact.
Yeah, I think you got to consider it for sure. It's just another one of those we care about you things, right? And to make sure you're encouraging people. I think still some people are afraid. Because if I go talk to somebody and it gets out, how am I going to be viewed? I think there's less of a concern these days, but I still think it's a big deal that people are concerned about having gone and talked to somebody.
I think it's still a big concern, and I think that the great leaders are starting to lead by vulnerable leadership and showing they're not superhuman and they feel it too, and that makes it more acceptable that you can be that way too.
Yeah, I have this thing. I may have said this to you while we were together last week, but when I come into the office, people will say, well, how are you doing? And my natural comment is peachy, right? That's when I'm in a good mood, things are going well, peachy. And about 2 weeks ago, I came into the office and somebody asked me, and I kind of looked and I said, not peachy. And they know then it was serious, right? So look, we have, it doesn't matter what level of leadership you are, that vulnerability which connects with people, which causes less people to leave because they don't trust you and think you're an ass and all this other kind of stuff. I'm not saying to go out there and tell them every one of your deepest, darkest secrets because they want to follow a confident leader. Most people. Yeah. But I think you do have to be vulnerable about, man, I was having a crappy day, and I did have a few of the team come to me afterwards and say, is there anything I can do to help? And one of them, I just kind of said, here's what was going on because they asked. And they provided a couple of pieces with somebody that reports to me, quote unquote, right? I thought that was awesome.
I think that is awesome, and you raise a great point. I build trust by hearing someone say things that aren't always the textbook, peachy, perfect answer. Like even today when I saw you this morning, I was like, how you doing? You're like, I'm getting over a cold. I'm like, okay, well, that's an honest answer. It wasn't just great. You know what I mean? So I kind of now trust you'll tell me how you're feeling if something was up.
And I think we need to create the same thing in our offices,
Yep.
because I do think it's a big part of what is actually going on. I mean, the other stat that we were talking about, and it came up in a question, is this whole thing around the people that are the buyer's remorse now that's happening. And I saw a couple of different stats on this, right? So 70%, and this is where the difference in the percentage, 70% of workers, millennials and Gen Zers, regret leaving their last job. That was number one. 20% in the Harris poll regret quitting. Now that was across all age generations. What's that about?
I think you and I have always had this approach that we believe in conflict. We believe disagree and have healthy conflict.
Yeah.
And I think too many employees, instead of fixing the issue at their company, think they'll just start over fresh somewhere else. And eventually, maybe it's a new issue that arises, and they never develop those skills to address and resolve that conflict.
Yeah.
And it's going to happen again, maybe a different conflict, but it's going to happen until you have the training and leadership to address that conflict head on. You're not going to be happy.
So do you think it's the collision of COVID, the economy, and the number of jobs that instead of having to address conflict, it's like, there's plenty of options, let me get the hell out of here? Do you think that it's that perfect collision of all those things going on?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. So the following numbers, so of the 20% that regret across all generations, I think it's a little higher than that. 36% say they lost work-life balance. 36% thought they were going somewhere better. 30%, it's not the expectation, right? The grass wasn't really greener on the other side. 24% missed the culture that they left, that they were bad-mouthing. And 24% didn't weigh the pros and cons appropriately and just left because it was easier to go. To your point about this conflict thing.
I do think that's a major problem. And I think that going back to the conflict thing, if someone says, I'm not happy, and you say, here's more money, 75% of the time they leave a year later.
I heard 70-20, University of Chicago.
Yeah.
The 70-12 rule,
Okay.
70% are gone within 12 months because nothing changed, or the employer saw you as disloyal and kicked your butt out of there anyways, which contributes to this actual
Which
problem.
loses more trust because you're thinking, they don't want to be here, I'm going to find the replacement.
So what do we do about this? Because I think the avoidance. So on one hand, you mentioned it, we have cancel culture.
Yep.
It's like, bam, I'm going to nail you. And on the other hand, we have groups of people that just won't deal with any conflict, which is contributing to this. There is no question.
Yep.
What do we do?
We have to promote the conflict, but ideally, not at the end, hey, I want to leave. Promote how to talk about it when there's just little bits of buzz or smoke or, fact gathering.
Yeah.
And I think by not being too extreme and too drastic and not pointing fingers, instead being accountable, say, Steve, I should have came to you sooner. I'm wondering if there's a way to make, me be able to work at home on Friday. I think do that in the beginning and not all of a sudden wait until you already have another job lined up before you ask that question.
Okay, this was not planned, but I'm going to do a shameless plug.
Yes.
Because this Thursday, the 28th, right, David? 28th at 11 o'clock? Difficult Conversations. I'm actually going to do a 90 minutes to 2-hour session on how do we actually have these difficult conversations. Whether it's the employee and the employer, whether it's two employees, whether it's you and your wife, it doesn't matter. Why do they go wrong? Why do we avoid them? And how do we actually approach them? And I do think that's the other thing causing this, is that people are running. And the reason I even say that, there's a stat, and I think I was sharing this with you earlier as well, is that and it's not just a Gen Z thing, but what's happening is people that have left jobs in the last 2 years are now saying, I'm happy to leave that job within the first 2 weeks. Now think about that. It used to be I'm going to stick it out for the next 2 to 3 years because it's on my resume. So you now have numbers in here, and I don't know what the percentage is because I didn't run the numbers, that have now, during COVID, using that as their excuse, have now left 4 to 5 times, causing the number to spike up even more about the turnover and the Great Resignation.
Sure.
But I don't know what the percentage is. Maybe it's 30% of them are the same frickin' people because they just always the grass is greener, instead of actually dealing with the conflict going on.
So I would love to hear your take. If you saw those resumes, what do you do with those now?
still have a conversation with them because I want to understand what's driving it. But if I'm interviewing somebody who's jump, I'm going to dig in a little bit more. Yeah, I didn't like this was going on. Okay, how did you approach them? Well, I didn't approach them. Okay, let's check the next one. I'm hesitant for somebody who's gone through 4 or 5 of those and never approached the organization to have the conversation. I get 1 is uncomfortable, maybe 2 out of 4. But if you're just skipping it on all of them, that's to me is probably going to look somewhat negative. Now, is that legally appropriate thing to say? I don't know, but I'm going to look at it and question it.
Absolutely.
Right? But I'm going to dig in first to understand the why and what you did. Now, if you went in and said, well, I went into my boss and I had this conversation and she or he said that they were going to do these things and I followed up a few weeks later, nothing was done, gave them one more opportunity, so I decided to move. Now that to me makes sense because I would do the same.
That's a great answer, but then a lot of people interviewing are taught never speak negatively about another employer. I want to hear your thoughts on that advice.
And I don't think you should bash them, but if you do it in the context of being honest without giving out anything that's confidential. You don't have to say, these are the 3 exact people I was talking about, but I had an issue with a coworker, and the way it was handled was probably not the best, so I let it happen one more time, and by the second time, I just felt it was best to leave. I don't know that you're throwing anybody under the bus. Now, if you come in guns a-blazing saying, that place sucks, I'm not going to look kindly on that. So I think you got to do it, because you left the organization. There's nothing wrong with saying why you left the organization without saying that they're a bad company.
Good
What are
point.
your thoughts?
I agree with you that you want to stick to the facts and not make pretty drastic conclusions because the new employer is going to feel like they could get bashed for some facts that were misunderstood again.
Well, so I'm going to interrupt and then I'll let you finish. And that happens, think about social media. It's happening all the time. So if you go on social media and they bash the last 2 places where they were 2 months, that's a red flag for me. Instantly a red flag.
No doubt. I'm having clients almost asking, is there a service where we can analyze how active they are on social media bashing people? Because I don't want that liability given cancel culture and the damages social media can cause in the workplace. So I think that I want the honesty from the employee, but I want them to be very factual and not trying to be a lawyer and explain how bad somebody else was. However, I am noticing a president of a company said, James, I've noticed that people that you're allowed to call as a reference are getting more generic. And a lot of it's legal and not worth the flip side. They don't want to disparage somebody and get sued. So if someone said, hey, they worked in this position from here to here and don't really say anything more, do you assume that's a negative reference? How do you take that information?
I don't personally, right? This is just my own opinion on it because who's going to really give you a bad reference in most cases?
Right.
Now, there are some cool tools out there that you can use that would be more anonymous, but I'm not a big fan of that as well. But if I call somebody up and they say, yeah, I can confirm that the person worked here to here and that's all I'm allowed to give per corporate policy, okay, whatever. I should be doing enough digging in my interview because when you look at it statistically, reference checks are only about a 4% predictor of success in the next role.
So speaking of predictors, you and I have been attending more and more sessions on assessments.
Yeah.
Well, what are your thoughts about that in evaluating, the right fit?
So, I mean, if I think about it from the context of the Great Resignation, right? Prior to using assessments in general, I think even as an organization, we made mishires where the reason that they didn't work out, either they chose to leave or we asked them to leave, were things we would have known about them ahead of time. So that's the positive side of it. However, I don't believe you should use an assessment to make a hiring decision. I think it should be weighed as a data point. No matter which assessment you decide to use, it should not be weighed as the only data point.
Fair.
That is dangerous, and I don't think it would stand up anyways. Right?
Yeah, legally you're not allowed to factor it in beyond a certain percentage.
Yeah, so I do think it helps us. So a lot of these people that said, the opportunity wasn't what I thought it was or something, sometimes it's a mismatch between how they're wired and the job that we want. But we like them, we connect with them, so we go with our gut, which is important, but they're really a mismatch for the job.
And that's another great point. I think too many job positions are advertised generically as VP or manager, and we're not doing a good enough job really explaining what the job entails.
And that's causing part of this. Guarantee you, if you're watching this, that is causing it. We are not properly talking about the job. We're not properly positioning the positions. We're talking about where we want to be as companies as an aspiration, not where we are now. They come in and they look around, and a week later they say, I'm getting that, you know what, out of here because of that exact reason.
And another point, I'm having more and more employers say, James, I just need someone with a pulse. Can you get me a body? And
Yes.
so what is your advice on hiring people, just to fill a seat?
They got a pulse, hire them. You want to stop the, so all my notes and all my stats that I was looking at this morning, all of the things that we talked about today, all are related to this. It's not one thing driving it. It's, again, lay COVID over the top of it, and it's exacerbating all these issues. But you want to stop this, or at least slow it down? Stop making stupid decisions. Stop putting a butt in a seat just because, hey, I got a position open, and if I don't fill that position, even though I know they're going to be gone in 4 or 5 months.
Yep.
I think that's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous.
I agree.
But I get the mentality and the pressure companies, managers, HR are under to put a butt in the seat given what's going on, because sometimes you don't have a butt in the seat. You're not billing if you're an attorney. You're not this if you're an attorney or any other position. So,
Right.
so it is a balance. But why we perpetuate our own problems, James, I sometimes don't know.
Agreed. Now, as a leader and as an employee, it seems like too many people are short-sighted, wanting to find the solution, for this month or this year. What do you think should be like the right way to look at it as far as, the right time frame?
The right time frame of solving the problem? Or
No, I mean, like, if I was an employee and someone says, I want to offer you this perk, do you think that you focus on quarterly intervals, yearly intervals, 10-year, 20-year plan? Like, what is the right mindset to see the chessboard of how to analyze an offer or the right fit for an employee?
Well, I don't think you can tell enough in a matter of a month because too many things change. I think you've got to give it some time to be able to do that. But I would also say if you're the employee who's you're getting into that next role, because some of these are legitimate, you want to make the move, you've got to be able to speak up too. So if you're not willing to speak up, whether you're there a month or whether you're there a year is kind of irrelevant.
Okay.
If you're willing to have some conversation, hey, you hired me to do this, these are some of the observation I have, and then weigh the response to that, whether it's a quarter, whether it's 6 months, whether it's a year, whether it's 2 years. I think it depends on the circumstance and what's going on, but I don't think you can tell anything in 6 weeks, a month, or what have you, especially if you don't say anything.
Yep.
That's my personal opinion.
Good. No, so I think the longer term is should be the new norm, and it's not for the most people.
It's not. It used to be 2-3 years. Now I'm not saying that that's right either,
Yep.
but this percentage of 44 or 46% that are saying I'm okay if I resign in my first 2 weeks. What? I've never seen that number that high before. I don't think that's helping, and I think that's probably tied to this idea of grass is always greener somewhere else. There's other options that are out there because that's what we're perpetuating instead of dealing with the potential conflict in my first few weeks. But if it's to help the company improve, hopefully it's not accepted as something bad. It's accepted as something good.
Well, great. Well, I think this has been fun. I think you summarized it right. The most important thing is learning how to have those difficult conversations if you want to survive this environment.
And they don't have to be that difficult. It's a matter of how we approach them. But I mean, this topic is not going to go away. But I do think that we've addressed a couple of key pieces where, we've got to get to know our teams. We've got to understand what makes them tick. We can't just rely on somebody else's stats because it's not necessarily relevant to our organization. And as leaders, we better do something about it sooner than later.
Agreed. Just like assessment stats are just one factor, data point to consider.
All right, so we have rambled on for 58 minutes. All right, here's the deal, guys. You and I have talked about this a number of times. We didn't want to saturate and have a lot of these out there, but we feel based on the response that we're going to continue doing the Leadership and Legal once a month. We're going to do this live. There'll be a complete different topic in each of these. Sometimes it'll be multiple topics. Before the next one, we'll blast out, this is the topic we want to talk about. We want your involvement. We want your questions. We want your thoughts on this. Weigh in, ask your questions. And if you want to come on and you got something to say that's related to people, leadership, legal, recruiting, engagement, the great resignation, the great shuffle, and you want to come on and join us in the studio, reach out to myself, reach out to James. We'll talk to you. We'd love to have you on.
Love to have you on the panel, and feel free to disagree.
Yeah, feel free to disagree. Just because we agreed on most things today doesn't mean James and I agree on everything. We've had that conversation.
We have.
We've had other folks that we loved. Look, part of the discourse is having a conversation about the other person's point of view and perspective. We don't have to agree with it, but we got to learn how to have a difficult conversation around it.
That's right.
And then move on from there. So we will see you. We will announce that in the next couple of weeks, what that's going to be, what that date is actually going to be. And again, if you want to join us, please reach out. Closing words, James.
Just empathetic leadership is a new style you got to be more self-aware of.
Yeah, in fact, I think it's a style. It's kind of like clothes. It was always there. It kind of comes back. It goes out of style, and then it comes back. I think it's one of those things.
Yep.
It should have never went out of style. It did, and now COVID is saying, holy crap, we better get back to it. And that's my belief on it, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Likewise.
Well, thank you for joining us again at another Leadership in Legal Live. Hopefully you got something out of this. If we didn't address your question, 734-837-8500 is my cell. Text it to me, James.
734-649-LUCKY1313.
I don't know why I had to write that down, because I know that frickin' number by heart as many times as I talk to you, but reach out to one of us, get us on social, and hopefully we'll be able to address your question next time around. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.